For this week's project, I opted to create a nice, cozy forest environment. Last month I went on a business trip to Finland for a couple of days to visit the studio I've been working with for the past 2 years. I spent 4 days there, and 2 of those were spent in a very rustic location, outside any major Finnish cities. So there I was, living just like the old Finnish people did back in the day. I guess it is no surprise that I decided, for my weekly project, to create something similar to the Nordic forests. As always, the project begins with one image, one photograph that inspires everything else in my mind. I always scatter through Pinterest to find images that wake up a certain feeling inside me. This was the image in this case. I really enjoyed the way the cabin was situated on top of the hill and had this interesting circular garden around it. And that was it. That was all I needed to move forward with my project. The work always begins in my favorite 3D software, which is of course Blender. The beginning of every single project, every single one of them, I always start by blocking out my scene. If I don't have a blockout, then I don't know the scale, distances between different elements of the scene, and pretty much I have nothing to base my work on later. It was enough to spend about 15 minutes or so blocking out this scene before I could actually move into production. The production itself started inside of Houdini. I knew I had to create a couple of really nice terrains for my scene, and whenever I think of creating some sort of landscape, I'm obviously thinking Houdini. Houdini has really great tools when it comes to creating landscapes procedurally. I was first introduced to this while working on Among the Trolls, the game the studio I'm working with have been developing for the past few years. I started by creating the foreground terrain, since this one was the most important to the scene as everything was going to sit on it. I laid down the basic shapes I was looking for, which is this circular plateau where the cabin is going to sit on. Afterwards, it was all about detailing the landscape and playing with the erosion. Once that was done, I could get into masking different parts of my terrain. I later used those masks to texture the landscape inside of Substance Painter. The same process was then repeated for the background landscape. For this guy, I wanted to create something similar to the common Iceland mountains with the deep valleys. The process was literally the same: create the main basic shapes of the landscape, detail the hell out of it, and then create the texture masks for substance. After I was done creating my 2 landscapes, I exported those as a mesh from Houdini and imported them into Substance where I would take care of texturing. All textures I used in this process are coming straight from Quixel's Megascans, which is the best place to go for AAA textures in my opinion. Using a combination of common Substance workflow and the mask I exported out of Houdini, I managed to get some really great looking landscapes which definitely fit the Nordic vibe. I then exported those textures as 4K texture sets and moved back into Blender. It is now time to switch my basic placeholder shapes I've made in the blocking out stage with the real deal. I imported the 2 landscapes into Blender, added nice textures on them, and voila, I already had a pretty decent looking scene and everything was started to take shape. I knew from the start that the next asset I had to work on was the second most important thing in the entire scene, which was the cabin, the focal point of this entire scene. I went ahead and started to actually model a more high quality cabin, basing the proportions and scale on my previous blockout mesh I've made in the first step. I knew the cabin was going to be pretty much filled with foliage and overgrown greeneries, so I actually didn't go crazy with the modeling and details. By setting up the camera in the first place, I also know exactly what I need, and there's no reason for me to spend time and effort working on details that will never be visible in the end anyway. That's one big reason it's so important to have your scene blocked out before you start doing anything else. It brings you a clear path and plan on what and how you need to do. Now that the cabin was done and set in place, I had to do a quick test on that foliage which will cover the cabin. Those were done with some simple Blender particle systems. I used some generic grass model from Botanic add-on and that was it really. Except it wasn't. At some point the scene got so heavy with all those instances of grass, especially after I scattered grass on the ground, that I had to find a solution for it, but more on that later. After my basic modeling was done, it was time to quickly UV unwrap this bad boy and send it straight into Substance Painter. I went ahead and did my best to create an old looking wooden cabin with the materials I had at my disposal. Honestly, I'm not too crazy about how the textures came out, but I also didn't care that much since the camera wasn't going to be a close-up shot, and I also knew that the overgrown foliage will mask a lot of the cabin anyway, so I just rolled with it. Okay, so now we're here, so what's next? Well, at this point I figured that the main elements of the scene were done. I mean, most of the scene is already in place, and the only things missing now are the filling elements to actually make this look like an environment. For that I started to scatter the grass on the foreground terrain. At this point my machine was swearing at me for making it go through rendering all those instances. It got so bad that I actually had to wait like 10 seconds every time I pressed a button or clicked something in Blender, and I knew that if I don't solve this issue, this project would simply get thrown into the trash bin because I wasn't about to work that way. And I also had a deadline to respect, which was not going to happen in this manner. I obviously knew what the big issue is: the grass instances. I was instancing tens of thousands of high quality grass models on this poor little terrain. What I did to fix this will probably not shock anyone, but I went into a new scene, imported that same grass asset, rendered an image out of it and created a grass patch out of planes only. The result? I got my Blender project file to go down from 700 megabytes to just 50 or 100 or so, and I could finally work like a normal human being, not having to wait every single press of the button for Blender to catch up with my genius and powerful brain. In the meantime, I also decimated those landscapes a little bit, especially the background mountains, since those would be covered in fog and other foliage, so it had absolutely no reason to be made out of millions of polygons. Now here I was, simply moving a few different trees around to create some interesting compositions in my environment. I got a few assets from Quixel, such as a boulder, a tree stump, a wooden bench and some barrels, and that was it. I called it an environment. I love using volumetrics for every single render I make, but this one was just not possible. I mean, it took the main render about 20 minutes to render at 4K with the 300 samples, while the volumetrics pass was taking about 47 at the time I stopped the render, and it didn't even render half of the volumetrics pass. So yeah, no volumetrics for me this time. I instead opted for the much more optimized thing, which is a mist pass. I did a couple of really low-res renderings to find out the optimal mist settings. I enabled the AO pass, and that was it. I hit render for the final thing. I took a few other cameras and moved them around to find some other interesting compositions and rendered those as well. Now it was time for post-production. This is basically getting all your passes, compositing them together, and then doing all the color correction and color grading you need. I composited the AO and mist pass on the top of my raw render, and now I was ready for the final touches: color correction and grading. This is where the render comes to life, for real. First of all, I always use Photoshop's camera raw filter to do the color work. First thing I always do is to make sure that I color correct my render. To do this, I always turn the image into a black and white image. This allows my eyes to not get hanged up into how the colors look and simply focus on the exposure, contrast, and the black and white points of my image. Once I'm happy with those things, I turn the color back on and I start color grading. For this, I simply go through all the settings the camera filter puts in my hands, and I simply try to make the most out of my renders. No actual rules or techniques here, just editing like I'm working on a normal photograph I took with my camera. Finally, I save up the editing into a preset so I can use it on the secondary renders as well, so they are all edited the same way. And that is it, I just call it a day. It is now time to enjoy the beauty of what I have created and also share with the world. So this was it. This was this week's project breakdown, and I hope you find those not only educational but entertaining as well. There's a new step-by-step tutorial coming out on Monday related to this project, so stay tuned for that. And until then, don't forget, stay creative.